The earth trembled, convulsing under the relentless onslaught of battle. A storm of fire and blood rained down from the heavens as the forces of chaos ripped through Lithan Prime, a city once vibrant and teeming with life. For weeks, terror had gripped the world. The sky, once a calming blue, had been stained a gruesome red by the warp breach, a festering wound suspended above the city's majestic spires. Through this unholy aperture, the armies of the warp poured forth. Heretical Chaos Space Marines, grotesque demons of Khorne and Slaanesh, bloodthirsty war bands of cultists, and a menagerie of twisted creatures that defied sanity. Against this tide of madness, the Salamanders Chapter of Space Marines stood defiant. Their emerald armour, symbols of hope and resilience, were a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness. But even their formidable might, forged in the fires of Nocturne, was buckling under the overwhelming pressure. Captain Nalon, a veteran of countless battles and a warrior of unwavering resolve, fought at the forefront of the defence. His emerald armour, once pristine, was now charred from plasma blasts and caked with the ichor of countless demons. With a thunderous roar, his thunderhammer, Forgebreaker, shattered the skull of a bloodletter, sending the creature's headless body flying across the ravaged battlefield. Bolterfire cracked in a relentless symphony around him, a desperate chorus against the encroaching doom. But despite their tenacity, their courage, the Salamanders were being relentlessly pushed back. For every Chaos Space Marine they felled, 2 more rose to take its place. Their numbers seemed endless, their hunger insatiable. "Captain!" Sergeant Dross shouted above the cacophony of war, his face grim, his voice strained. He unleashed a burst of heavy bolter fire into the advancing horde, tearing through flesh and bone. "They're endless!" Nalon turned, grimacing beneath his helmet, his heart heavy with dread. "Hold the line, brother. Lithan Prime cannot fall to these heretics." But the line was crumbling, dissolving under the relentless assault. Through the swirling mists of warp energy, more demons surged into reality, an endless tide of fury and corruption. Then, a towering form emerged from the swirling chaos. A Hellbrute, its flesh fused with cursed metal, its existence an abomination. Its massive power claw, crackling with unholy energy, carved through the Salamanders' ranks, sending bodies flying like ragdolls. Nalon's heart sank. The enemy was overwhelming, their numbers inexhaustible. Then the ground shuddered again, not from the pounding boots of chaos, but from something deeper, something ancient. A ripple tore through reality, different from the chaotic breach of the warp. It felt wrong, unnatural, yet strangely focused, controlled. A scream split the air, a piercing wail that transcended pain and fear. It was the dying cry of demons, a sound that spoke of unimaginable terror. "Captain, look!" a Marine shouted, pointing towards the warp breach above them, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and apprehension. What they saw defied understanding, challenged their very perception of reality. The demons were retreating, fleeing back into the warp as if pursued by something even they feared.
The Hellbrute, which had been moments away from cleaving through another squad of salamanders, hesitated, its unholy eyes flickering towards the breach, its mechanical mind struggling to comprehend the shifting tide. More demons scrambled back towards the rift, their guttural screams echoing through the ruined city. Chaos Space Marines glanced at one another, confusion etched on their twisted visages. Even the blood-crazed berserkers of Khorne paused in their slaughter, their axes dripping with blood, their eyes wide with primal fear. Something was coming. From the very heart of the warp rift, a figure emerged. Hulking, clad in tarnished green armor, smeared with the blood of demons and heretics alike. But it was not the armor that made him terrifying, that set him apart from the legions of chaos. It was the aura of death that clung to him, the palpable sense of unending fury that radiated from his very being. His face, half hidden beneath a shattered helmet, bore a cold, murderous gaze that spoke of endless rage, of battles fought and victories won against impossible odds. The Doomslayer had arrived. Captain Incalion watched in disbelief as the lone figure strode through the battlefield, wading through the carnage, tearing into the retreating demons with savage brutality. The Hellbrute, sensing the threat, turned and unleashed a torrent of molten plasma from its gun arm, a desperate attempt to stem the tide. The Doomslayer barely acknowledged it. He leaped through the air with blinding speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat, grabbing onto the Hellbrute's massive form with inhuman strength. He tore open the metal plating, exposing the wretched, pulsating flesh beneath. He reached in, and with a single, violent motion, ripped out the beast's core, silencing its roars forever. The mechanical monstrosity crashed to the ground, its unholy existence extinguished. The remaining Chaos Space Marines opened fire on the Doomslayer, their bolters and plasma guns roaring in unison, a desperate barrage of firepower. But the Doomslayer was unstoppable. He moved like a storm, dodging, weaving, and closing the distance in seconds. With his shotgun in hand, he fired into the face of a Chaos Marine, blowing the corrupted Astartes' helmet and head apart in an explosion of gore. His fists followed next, crushing skulls, shattering armor, and decimating the Chaos forces as if they were nothing more than paper. A Bloodthirster, sensing its pride was at stake, emerged from the warp portal, bellowing a challenge. It towered over the battlefield, wings outstretched, a massive axe clutched in its bloodied hand. The Doomslayer turned his gaze upon it, his eyes burning with a hatred that transcended the mortal realm. In a blur of motion, he leapt onto the demon, driving his blade, a brutal, serrated knife, deep into the creature's neck. With a swift, savage twist, he decapitated the Bloodthirster in one fluid motion. The demon's headless body crashed to the ground like a falling monument, shaking the very foundations of Lithan Prime. Incalion could barely comprehend what he was seeing. By Vulcan's flame! The Doomslayer moved faster than any mortal, faster than any space marine. He tore through the Chaos forces with reckless abandon, a whirlwind of death that the demons and heretics could not withstand. He pushed forward towards the warp portal, leaving a trail of corpses in his wake, forcing the once unstoppable horde of chaos back through their own breach. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The Doomslayer stood at the edge of the battlefield, breathing heavily, surrounded by the shattered bodies of his enemies. His green armor was splattered with the blood of demons and Chaos Marines alike, his hands dripping with ichor. The Salamanders, stunned into silence, watched the figure as he turned towards them. They raised their bolters, their fingers hovering over their triggers, uncertain of who or what this being was. "Identify yourself," Captain Nkalian barked, his voice firm despite the awe and unease that gripped him. The Doomslayer said nothing at first. He stepped closer, his eyes burning with intensity, his muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with a single, deliberate motion, the Doomslayer reached into the pile of corpses at his feet and picked up the severed head of a massive demon, its face twisted in a permanent scream of agony. He tossed the head at Nkalian's feet, the heavy thud echoing through the battlefield. "Show me where I can find more," the Doomslayer growled, his voice low and filled with wrath. For a moment, there was only silence. The Salamanders exchanged glances, still unsure whether this warrior was an ally or a threat. But Nkalian, ever the pragmatist, nodded slowly, lowering his bolter. "More will come," Nkalian said, his voice steady. "Chaos is never far." The Doomslayer nodded in return, his eyes burning with a savage hunger. He turned away, glancing back towards the warp rift as though daring the forces of the Immaterium to return. The Salamanders had fought countless battles against the horrors of chaos. They had seen entire worlds consumed by the warp, their skies torn open by the madness of the gods. But never had they witnessed something like this. A force of nature incarnate, a being that seemed to thrive on the slaughter of demons. Captain Nkalian clenched his fists, feeling a strange sense of kinship with the Doomslayer, despite the brutal ferocity that separated them. "Prepare for the next assault, brothers," he commanded. "We fight alongside the Slayer today." And as the sky above Lithan Prime crackled with warp energy, as the storm of chaos once again gathered on the horizon, the Salamanders knew one thing for certain. The Doomslayer was here to kill, and the war had only just begun. The roar of the dropship's engines filled the cabin as Captain Nkalian and his Salamanders' squad prepared for their next mission. The air was thick with tension, a palpable anticipation of the battles to come. They were speeding through the void, bound for the planet of Khorne 4, where a Necron tomb world had awakened. The Doomslayer, the mysterious warrior who had single-handedly decimated the forces of chaos on Lithan Prime, stood silently among them, his imposing form as still as stone. He hadn't said a word since boarding the ship, his cold gaze locked forward as if seeing only the next battlefield in his mind. Nkalian, sitting across from the Doomslayer, studied him carefully. Despite the Doomslayer's terrifying prowess, the Salamanders' captain felt no fear, only curiosity. This was a man, or perhaps something more, whose fury was unmatched even by the most bloodthirsty of space marines. His armor, smeared with demon blood and blackened by combat, looked ancient yet unbreakable. His eyes, however, held a darkness that not even the endless war against chaos could fully explain. Sergeant Dross broke the silence, leaning forward slightly, his voice low and respectful. "You fight like a berserker, Slayer. Where did you come from?" The Doomslayer didn't respond. He remained motionless, as though lost in the throes of some inner battle. Dross shared a glance with Nakalian, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Another salamander brother, Vizoran, attempted next. "You fought well against the demons. We could use warriors like you against the Necron Scourge." Still no answer. The Doomslayer's hand, resting on his massive combat shotgun, tightened its grip slightly. But that was the only sign that he had heard them at all. His eyes remained fixed on the front of the dropship, ignoring the conversation around him. Nakalian exhaled, settling back in his seat. He had seen many warriors in his time, each with their own demons, but none quite like this. There was something primal about the Doomslayer, something that made even the stoic captain wary. "He's not here for conversation," Nakalian said, his voice low, a warning to his squad. "Let him be. We'll soon see what he's truly capable of." Moments later, the dropship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Karan 4. The once vibrant planet had been reduced to a wasteland of blackened, ashen ground. Massive Necron obelisks dotted the landscape like the claws of ancient gods, each one pulsing with unnatural energy. As the dropship descended, the faint crackle of Necron Gauss weaponry echoed through the air, signalling that the battle was already underway. The ramp of the dropship slammed down, revealing the chaos outside. Necron warriors, with their soulless eyes and metallic frames, marched in perfect formation, their weapons firing beams of energy that disintegrated anything in their path. Imperial Guard forces were already entrenched, doing their best to hold back the tide, but it was clear that they were losing ground rapidly. The Salamanders squad wasted no time charging down the ramp and into the fray. But even as they moved with purpose, the Doomslayer had already leapt ahead of them, launching himself into the heart of the Necron army with terrifying speed. He moved like a force of nature, his shotgun barking out deafening blasts as he tore through the metallic ranks. Each shot reduced a Necron warrior to shattered fragments of metal, their bodies collapsing in heaps before they could even raise their weapons. The Doomslayer's fists followed, crushing Necron skulls and ripping limbs from torsos in a brutal display of strength. Nkalian and his squad fought their way towards the Doomslayer, cutting down Necron immortals and destroyers as they advanced. But it was clear that the Slayer didn't need their help. The Necrons, relentless and unfeeling as they were, seemed almost hesitant to face him, as if some ancient fear had been awakened in their mechanical minds. Sergeant Dross fed a bolt round into the chest of a Necron destroyer, sending it crashing to the ground. He glanced at the Doomslayer, who had just ripped apart a Triarch Praetorian with his bare hands, and muttered under his breath, "Emperor's mercy." But as the battle raged on, the Doomslayer's fury seemed to shift, to focus. He paused for a moment, standing over the broken bodies of his enemies, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the battlefield.
And then he turned back towards Nkalian, who was finishing off a Necron immortal with a blast from his plasma gun. "These are not demons," the Doomslayer growled, his voice low and filled with suspicion. His gaze shifted to the Salamanders, his eyes piercing. "What are these?" Nkalian, breathing heavily from the fight, stepped forward. "They're Necrons, an ancient race of soulless machines, risen from their tombs to reclaim the galaxy." "But that's not why we're here," Vizoran added, his voice grim. The Doomslayer's eyes locked onto Unkalian's, cold and unblinking. "Explain." Unkalian gestured towards a massive structure on the horizon. A colossal, pyramid-like tomb, its walls shimmering with dark energy. "There's something more on this planet. An artifact was discovered deep within that Necron tomb. Our librarians sensed it. A presence of the warp, of chaos. We believe it was what triggered the Necrons to awaken. Something far worse than them is here." As if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled. A cold, malevolent laugh echoed across the battlefield, freezing the blood of every warrior present. The Necrons halted their attack, their attention seemingly diverted by the same presence. A figure stepped out of the shadows from behind the towering Necron obelisk. His black armor gleaming with dark, corrupted energy. His massive, spiked silhouette was unmistakable. Abaddon the Despoiler, champion of chaos, war master of the Black Legion, Visoran whispered, his voice filled with dread. "You sense it, don't you?" Abaddon's voice was a growl filled with malice. "The power of the warp, the true dominion of the galaxy. This planet belongs to chaos now, and you will fall like all the rest." Unkalian's blood turned cold as he saw the War Master of Chaos in the flesh. He had faced many enemies, but Abaddon was a legend of destruction, a force that had toppled worlds and shattered empires. The Salamanders raised their bolters, but Abaddon's presence alone seemed to darken the sky, as though the planet itself recoiled in fear. But the Doomslayer's reaction was different. He stepped forward, his cold eyes lighting up with a familiar rage as he sized up the new threat. A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That's more like it," the Doomslayer growled, his hands tightening around his shotgun. Without another word, the Doomslayer charged towards Abaddon, moving faster than any mortal should. His shotgun roared to life, firing blast after blast at the War Master. Abaddon raised his Talon of Horus, deflecting the shots with ease, his dark laughter echoing through the air. "You think you can challenge me, mortal?" Abaddon sneered, his eyes glowing with the power of the warp. "I am the Despoiler. I have torn down empires, shattered armies. You are nothing but a gnat to me." The Doomslayer's only response was a growl of pure fury. He leapt into the air, closing the distance between them in an instant. His fist, covered in blood and gore, slammed into Abaddon's chest with a force that shook the ground. The War Master staggered back, momentarily stunned by the sheer power of the blow. But Abaddon was no ordinary foe. He roared in anger, swinging the Talon of Horus in a wide arc. The Doomslayer dodged with lightning reflexes, rolling to the side and firing his shotgun point blank into Abaddon's side. The blast tore through Abaddon's armor, sending shards of black ceramite flying. The Kalian and the Salamanders, sensing their opportunity, opened fire on Abaddon's Black Legion warriors, engaging them in a furious battle. Their eyes kept flicking back to the duel between the Doomslayer and the War Master, unable to tear themselves away from the spectacle.
The Doomslayer fought with a brutality and skill that even the hardened Salamanders had never seen. He was relentless, each strike more savage than the last. Abaddon, for all his power and strength,
found himself on the defensive, his every move countered by the Slayer's sheer ferocity. With a bellow of rage, Abaddon summoned the power of the warp, sending a wave of dark energy crashing into the Doomslayer. The ground split beneath them, and the air crackled with malevolent energy. But the Doomslayer didn't flinch. He stepped through the warp energy as though it were nothing, his eyes blazing with cold determination. His shotgun rang out one last time, the blast striking Abaddon square in the chest and sending the War Master crashing to the ground. Abaddon, breathing heavily, stared up at the Doomslayer in disbelief, blood leaking from his wounds. "Impossible. You cannot defeat me." The Doomslayer stood over him, his cold gaze unyielding. "I don't care who you are." And with that, the Doomslayer raised his foot and brought it down with all his might, crushing Abaddon's head into the dirt. For a moment, there was only silence. The remaining forces of Chaos, seeing their leader defeated, began to retreat, disappearing into the warp. The Necrons, too, fell back into their tombs, the energy that had awakened them fading as quickly as it had come. Nkalian, covered in blood and debris, approached the Doomslayer cautiously. You killed Abaddon." The Doomslayer turned to face him, his eyes still burning with fury. "Where's the next one?" Nkalian nodded slowly, understanding now the true nature of the Doomslayer. He was no mere warrior. He was a force of vengeance, a weapon forged in the fires of endless war. "More will come," Nkalian said, his voice steady. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The Doomslayer nodded once, then turned away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The war was far from over, but for now, the battlefield was silent, and the Slayer, as always, was ready for the next fight. The roar of the dropship's engines echoed in the silence of the aftermath. Smoke billowed from the battlefield below as the Salamanders' victory against Abaddon's forces lingered in their minds. Captain Nkalian and his squad were spent but resolute, having witnessed the impossible. The Doomslayer had crushed Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, beneath his boot. The Salamanders moved swiftly to secure the battlefield, extracting wounded soldiers and gathering what few supplies remained before the team ascended into the dropship. The Doomslayer stood motionless near the edge of the ramp, his imposing figure framed by the hellish landscape. His silence spoke louder than any words, and his presence alone seemed to command respect. As the ramp closed, the dropship lifted into the darkened sky, pulling away from Karan IV's scorched surface. Inside the cramped quarters of the ship, Nkalian stole a glance at the Slayer, still wordless, his armour still dripping with the blood of his enemies. His cold, unblinking gaze remained fixed on the horizon. Sergeant Dross leaned over to Vesoran, shaking his head. "I fought alongside maniacs, zealots and beasts. I've never seen anything like him." Vesoran nodded grimly. "He's not just a warrior. He's something else." "Let him be," Nkalian said, overhearing their exchange.
We're lucky he's on our side. The Emperor's will works in strange ways. The dropship's engines hummed, cutting through the void as it carried them toward the nearest Imperial base for extraction. But the sense of relief was short-lived. A violent shudder rippled through the hull, the ship lurching to the side. "What the?" Dross stumbled, bracing himself against the wall. And Carlian's instincts kicked in immediately. "Pilot, status report." The pilot's voice crackled over the Vox link, filled with panic. "We've got Orc warband ships on our tail. They're firing!" The ship shuddered violently again, alarms blaring as red lights flashed across the cabin. Explosions echoed from the rear of the vessel.
And Carlian felt his guts tighten as the dropship's engines sputtered. "Brace for impact!" the pilot screamed. The ship's descent became erratic as it veered off course. The salamanders scrambled for handholds, locking themselves into the crash webbing as the ship plummeted towards a nearby planet's surface. The roar of engines became deafening, and the temperature inside the ship spiked as it began its uncontrolled fall. And Carlian shouted over the cacophony, "Hold on, brothers!" The impact was brutal. The dropship slammed into the planet's surface, splitting in two as it crashed into a dense jungle. The sound of tearing metal filled the air, and flames erupted as the ship's remains scattered across the landscape. For a moment, everything was still, save for the crackling of flames and the distant screeching of Orc war machines. Groaning, Carlian pushed debris off his chest, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. His squad was scattered, but alive. Dross and Vasoran helped pull the others from the wreckage. "We've got wounded," Vasoran muttered, checking the others. "Where's the Doomslayer?" Carlian asked, his voice grim. Dross looked around, eyes narrowing. I don't see him." Carlian stood, surveying the broken landscape around them. The ship had torn a deep scar into the earth upon impact, and the wreckage was scattered far and wide. But there was no sign of the Doomslayer. The ship's violent crash had split them apart, and it seemed the Slayer had been thrown from the wreckage. "We're not alone," Dross said, his voice tense. A guttural roar echoed through the jungle, followed by the unmistakable clanging of Orc machinery. From the tree line, Orc war bosses and their boys emerged, snarling and laughing with savage glee. The dropship's fiery crash had drawn their attention, and now they were converging on the survivors. "Orcs!" Vasoran shouted, raising his bolter as a mob of greenskins charged forward, their crude weapons raised high. The salamanders opened fire, but the Orcs outnumbered them heavily. The initial volleys cut down several of the charging greenskins, but the Orcs were relentless, and their numbers overwhelming. And Carlian's squad was holding their ground, but it was clear that they were being pushed back. The salamanders were slowly getting surrounded, and their position was becoming untenable. "We can't hold this for long," Dross grunted, smashing his chainsword through an Orc's skull before being forced back by another wave of attackers. "Where's the Doomslayer?" Vasoran shouted, firing bolt rounds into the oncoming horde. "Focus on surviving," Carlian ordered, but even he knew their chances were slim without the Doomslayer. Just as the Orcs closed in, there was a deafening roar from the tree line, different from the war cries of the greenskins. A hulking figure burst from the shadows, moving faster than any mortal warrior. The Doomslayer had returned, and his fury was palpable. He tore into the Orcs like a predator among prey, his doomblade a blur of death and destruction.
The blade glowed with hellish energy, severing limbs, heads and torsos in a whirlwind of carnage. The orcs, for all their brutish strength, had no answer for the Slayer's brutality. One by one they fell, their blood painting the jungle floor as the Doomslayer cut a swathe through their ranks. An orc knob, massive and towering over the others, charged at the Doomslayer, swinging its massive axe. But the Slayer was quicker. He ducked under the swing, drove his Doomblade into the knob's gut, and ripped upward, splitting the beast in half with one brutal motion. The sight of their knob's death sent ripples of fear through the remaining orcs. Some hesitated, while others began to retreat. But the Doomslayer wasn't done. He hurled himself at the retreating orcs, his hands turning into fists of rage as he crushed skulls and snapped spines with ease.
With the Doomslayer's brutal assault tipping the balance, Nkalian and his squad rallied. The Salamanders fought with renewed vigour, cutting down the remaining orcs who dared to stand and fight. The jungle echoed with the dying screams of the greenskins, until at last the battlefield fell silent once more. Nkalian, panting and covered in blood, approached the Doomslayer, who stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving with controlled breaths. "You did it again," Nkalian said, offering a nod of respect. "You saved us." The Doomslayer said nothing, his cold gaze scanning the horizon for more enemies. It was clear to Nathalion that words meant little to this warrior. Sergeant Drasso grinned, wiping blood from his face. "What do you say, Slayer? Want to join the Salamanders as an honorary brother? We could use someone like you." There was no response from the Doomslayer. His silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. But Drasso simply chuckled. "We'll take that as a yes." With the orcs defeated, Nathalion signalled his squad to set up a perimeter. They had sustained injuries, but nothing too severe. With a beacon now activated, help was on the way, though it would be hours before reinforcements arrived. The Salamanders took the opportunity to rest, though their eyes remained alert for any more surprises. But while the others rested, the Doomslayer was anything but calm. As he stood watch over the jungle, a strange sensation washed over him. Something dark, insidious, creeping at the edges of his mind. A voice whispered, low and malevolent, calling to him from the depths of his psyche. Power. Strength. You could save them all. Mankind could be yours to protect, if you only embrace us. The Chaos Gods. Their voices dripped with temptation, promising strength beyond imagination. For the first time, the Doomslayer paused, his fists clenched as the dark voices filled his mind. "We see your rage, Slayer. We see your hunger for vengeance. We offer you the means to end it all, to destroy the enemies of man once and for all. Accept our gift, and we will grant you dominion over the galaxy." In his mind, the Doomslayer appeared to consider the offer. He was no stranger to violence, no stranger to power. He had fought for countless ages, wading through blood and death. His voice, cold and deliberate, answered the Chaos Gods. "What must I do?" The voices hissed in delight. "Our champion awaits you. Meet him, and he will bless you with the power you seek." The dark whispers faded, leaving the Doomslayer in silence once more. But his gaze remained fixed,
unyielding, his decision locked in place as the stars twinkled above, far beyond the planet's atmosphere. Something stirred. A Tyranid fleet, massive and hungry, had intercepted the Salamander's distress beacon. The great devourer turned its gaze toward the crash site, its tendrils extending toward the doomed planet below, sensing the life force ripe for consumption. The whispers of the Chaos gods were momentarily drowned out by the gnawing hunger of the hive mind. The roaring inferno of the crash site still sizzled as the Salamanders regrouped, patching their wounds and fortifying their perimeter. Captain Nathalion stood watch over his surviving brothers, his gaze shifting toward the horizon, where the dense jungle stretched far into the distance, teeming with unseen horrors. They were stranded, battered, but alive. For now. In the distance, the Doomslayer loomed like a shadow, unmoving. He stood over the mangled corpses of the orcs he had slain, his presence a fortress of stoic rage. None of the Salamanders dared disturb him. His silence, coupled with the terrifying brutality he unleashed, spoke volumes. His helmet remained locked forward, as if he were waiting for something. Nathalion's vox-link crackled. "Captain, no signal from Imperial Command yet.
We're blind out here. Keep trying, Vashon. We don't have the luxury of time," Nathalion replied, his voice tight with concern. A low hum suddenly vibrated the air around them, growing louder by the second. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Nathalion spun, bolter raised as the salamanders followed suit. From the jungle's darkened sky, monstrous shapes began descending, blotting out the stars. Winged beasts, serpentine and grotesque, swooped down with terrifying speed. Behind them, swarms of Tyranid creatures emerged from the trees, their screeches piercing through the night. The Salamander's bolters flared to life, unleashing volleys of fire into the sky as the Tyranids closed in. Flesh borers and spore mines exploded overhead as winged gargoyles darted through the sky, their talons outstretched, aiming for the vulnerable survivors. "They found us," Drasso bellowed, tearing a gargoyle apart with his chainsword as it swooped too close, its lifeless body thudding to the ground. "It's a Tyranid hive fleet fragment," Nathalion growled, his eyes narrowing. "They must have intercepted our beacon. Hold the line, brothers." The ground rumbled again, and with it came the sound of hundreds of scuttling legs and the gnashing of alien mandibles. The Tyranid swarm surged forward, with Hormagaunts and Termagaunts charging through the underbrush in an unstoppable wave. The Salamanders formed a defensive line, their bolters firing relentlessly, but for every Xenos they put down, more took its place. The Doomslayer stood on the front line, unbothered by the chaos around him. He fired his shotgun point blank into a charging Tyranid warrior, its skull vaporized by the impact. Another Tyranid lunged at him, but he grabbed it mid-air, snapping its spine in a brutal twist before crushing its skull beneath his boot. Even as the swarm encroached, his movements remained methodical, a machine of pure destruction. But the swarm was unending. Soon, the salamanders were being overwhelmed. The air was thick with spores, the jungle alight with muzzle flashes, and the sound of screeching aliens filled the night. Even with the Doomslayer at their side, the numbers were against them. "We can't hold forever," Vashon yelled, slamming a magazine into his bolter as he gunned down more Tyranids. As if in response to his words, the trees on the far side of the clearing trembled violently,
Something massive approached, crushing trees beneath its monstrous weight. The salamanders braced themselves as a towering carnifex burst from the underbrush, its chitinous armor gleaming in the moonlight, and its eyes burned with a ravenous hunger. "Emperor preserve us," Drasso muttered, his face pale under the green light. The carnifex roared, its massive maw opening wide as it charged forward, trampling over its own lesser brethren. Its crushing claws smashed aside a salamander, sending him flying into a tree, his armor crumpling from the impact. The creature barreled toward the Doomslayer with terrifying speed. "Slayer, watch out!" Nathalion shouted, but his warning came too late. The Doomslayer barely had time to turn before the carnifex struck, its claws closing around him with bone-shattering force. The creature let out a guttural roar and lifted the Slayer into the air, savoring its victory. Without hesitation, it shoved the Doomslayer into its gaping maw, swallowing him whole. The salamanders could only watch in horror as the carnifex devoured their unstoppable ally. "Doomslayer, no!" Vashon gasped, his voice filled with despair. The carnifex reared back, letting out a triumphant roar as it devoured its prey, its massive body trembling with satisfaction. But the victory was short-lived. A loud crack echoed from within the creature. The carnifex paused, its roar faltering. Another crack. This time, a jet of greenish blood spurted from the beast's side. The creature staggered, its eyes wide with confusion,
the hive mind struggling to understand the anomaly within. Then, with a sickening squelch, its massive head exploded, showering the battlefield in gore. From the torn carcass of the carnifex, the Doomslayer emerged, his armor dripping with alien ichor. In one hand he held his shotgun, smoke rising from the barrel. With the other, he reached out and tore through the creature's viscera, pulling himself free from the now lifeless corpse. He stood atop the carnifex's broken body, unbothered, as if he had simply swatted a fly. The sight sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The remaining Tyranids faltered, their hive mind rattled by the display of raw power. The Salamanders, emboldened by the Doomslayer's resilience, redoubled their efforts. The bolters sang once more, cutting down the remaining swarm with ruthless precision. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was over within minutes. With the Carnifex dead and their swarm disrupted, the Tyranids began to retreat, fleeing into the darkened jungle, their hunger momentarily satiated by the loss of their vanguard. Nathalion wiped blood from his face, watching as the last of the Xenos scuttled away. "By the Emperor, he's unstoppable," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. Drasso grinned, limping over to stand beside his captain. "I think the Tyranids got more than they bargained for." Before Nathalion could respond, the crackle of the Vox-link brought a wave of relief. "Captain, this is Strike Force Victorious. We've picked up your beacon. Hold tight, reinforcements are en route." The Salamanders let out a collective sigh of relief. Help was finally on the way. As the reinforcements arrived and began to extract the battered survivors, the Doomslayer made his way silently to the drop zone. His expression remained impassive, but there was something stirring behind his eyes, something dark and determined. Once aboard the Salamanders battle barge, Nathalion noticed the Doomslayer heading toward the ship's armory. He watched as the Slayer methodically stocked up on ammunition, his movements deliberate and calculated. He grabbed a bolter, a chainsword, and enough ammunition to last a lifetime. But there was something more. Something in the way the Slayer carried himself, as if he were preparing for a journey that no one else could follow. Nathalion approached cautiously. "Slayer, what are you doing?" The Doomslayer didn't answer, simply holstered his weapons and turned toward a smaller vessel in the hangar bay. "Where are you going?" Drasso called out, his voice filled with concern. The Doomslayer paused, glancing over his shoulder. His gaze was cold and unwavering, yet he said nothing. With that, he boarded the vessel and fired up its engines. The Salamanders watched in stunned silence as the ship lifted off and sped into the void, vanishing into the stars. The barren planet was silent, lifeless. Dust storms swept across its desolate surface, and the blackened sky hung low and oppressive. The Doomslayer stood alone, his ship having landed with a dull thud. In the distance, he had followed the coordinates, and now he waited. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from the horizon, a shape emerged, massive, towering, and terrifying. Angron, demon Primarch of the World Eaters, materialized from the shadows, his blood-red armor glowing with malevolent power. His eyes burned with hatred, and his presence was like a living furnace, scorching everything in his path. "You have come," Angron growled, his voice like grinding steel. "You know what you seek. Kneel before me, Slayer. Accept the gifts of the Chaos Gods, and I will grant you power beyond your wildest imagination." The Doomslayer stepped forward, his boots crunching against the cracked earth. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed. Angron laughed, his voice booming across the wasteland. "Yes, submit, and the galaxy will be yours to destroy." The demon Primarch strode toward the kneeling figure, his massive hand outstretched to bestow his dark blessing. But as Angron drew close, the Doomslayer moved. In an instant, he was on his feet, his chainsword igniting with a roar. With lightning speed, he drove the blade into Angron's midsection, splitting armor and flesh alike. The demon Primarch howled in rage, swinging his massive axe at the Doomslayer. But the Doomslayer was too fast. He ducked beneath the swing and fired his bolt pistol point blank into Angron's chest. The explosive rounds tore chunks of flesh from the Chaos Primarch's body. The battle was savage and brutal. Angron's strength was terrifying, and every blow he landed sent the Doomslayer reeling. Even the Slayer, who had fought countless demonic horrors, could feel the weight of Angron's fury in each strike. The Doomslayer's armor cracked and dented under the relentless assault, and blood seeped from his wounds. But he didn't falter. His grip on his chainsword tightened, and his rage burned brighter, unyielding. With a roar, the Doomslayer surged forward, his chainsword revving as he swung with brutal precision. He struck again and again, each blow chipping away at Angron's monstrous form. But Angron retaliated, his claws and teeth gnashing, his strength fueled by the dark energies of chaos. But the Doomslayer's resilience was unbreakable. His sheer will and tenacity matched even the might of a demon Primarch. At last, the Doomslayer saw his opening. Angron raised his axe high, leaving his torso exposed. Seizing the moment, the Doomslayer drove his chainsword into Angron's midsection, the teeth of the blades biting deep into his corrupted flesh. Angron let out a roar of agony, blood spraying as the chainsword dug deeper. The Doomslayer twisted the blade, then wrenched it upward, tearing a massive gash through Angron's body. Angron staggered backward, clutching the wound, his expression twisted with fury and disbelief. The Doomslayer didn't let up. He holstered his chainsword and drew his bolt pistol, unleashing a relentless volley of shots directly into Angron's chest and face. The rounds exploded on impact, each one tearing more chunks from the demon Primarch's flesh. Angron stumbled, his strength waning as the Doomslayer closed in for the final blow. With one last roar, the Doomslayer raised his chainsword and brought it down with all his might. The blade bit deep into Angron's neck, and with a brutal twist, he severed the demon Primarch's head from his body. For a moment, there was silence. The chaos energies that had once surrounded Angron's body dissipated, leaving only the mangled remains of the fallen Primarch. The Doomslayer stood over the corpse, breathing heavily, his armor battered and blood-stained, but victorious. High above the planet, the Salamanders' battle barge hovered, having tracked the Doomslayer's ship to the barren world below. Captain Nathalion and his squad descended to the surface, drawn by the unmistakable aura of chaos and the echoes of the violent battle that had just transpired. As they approached, they saw the Doomslayer standing amidst the remains of Angron. The once mighty demon Primarch lay in pieces, his blood soaking into the cracked earth. Nathalion felt a surge of awe and disbelief. They had come to track their strange ally, but they had not expected to find Angron, one of the Chaos Primarchs, defeated. The Salamanders approached, weapons lowered, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. "Slayer," Nathalion said, his voice tinged with reverence. "We did not think it possible to kill a demon Primarch. Yet here you stand." The Doomslayer turned his gaze, cold and resolute. Nathalion took a step forward, his expression softening. "You don't need to fight alone. We are your brothers. Let us stand beside you." The Doomslayer was silent, his gaze shifting from the Salamanders to the battered battlefield. After a moment he nodded, but his eyes held something more than just victory. They held a vision, a purpose yet unfulfilled. "We'll need more than just strength to face what comes next," he growled, his voice rasping, the first words they'd heard him speak clearly. "Help me build a weapon, one that can end the threat of these chaos gods for good." Nathalion's eyes widened, and a smile of understanding crossed his face. The Salamanders would stand with him. Together, they would forge a weapon of unimaginable power, one to strike at the heart of chaos itself. As they gathered the fallen Angron's remains, the Doomslayer's gaze drifted to the heavens, where the shadows of the chaos gods lingered, watching with fury. He clenched his fists, a silent promise burning within him. Chaos would tremble, for this was only the beginning. As the hangar doors groaned shut and the aftermath of Angron's defeat settled, the Salamanders gathered in the dimly lit chamber. The air was thick with the mingling scents of burned metal, sweat, and the coppery tang of blood. Battle-worn, yet resolute, they huddled around a flickering holographic projection, displaying the blueprints left by their new, enigmatic ally, the Doomslayer. This stranger in their midst had spoken little, his stoic silence shrouded in a palpable intensity. Yet he had swiftly gained their respect with his merciless skill against the forces of chaos. The hologram projected a blueprint of a weapon unfamiliar even to the most seasoned tech priests. A colossal energy weapon of alien design and unknown origin. Something the Doomslayer referred to simply as the BFG. Beside it hovered the schematics for a mysterious energy sword, a blade seemingly infused with warp energy, an unsettling power, but one they could not overlook given its potential. Captain Nathalion, one of the tech priests, murmured in awe, his mechadendrites twitching.
"I've never seen anything like this. The energy signature alone suggests power drawn directly from the warp." Nathalion gave a grim nod, his gaze flickering to the silent figure of the Doomslayer, who stood apart from the group, his arms crossed, watching them with an intensity that seemed to pierce the metal walls. The Salamander captain could sense the weariness amongst his brothers, the unspoken questions weighing heavily on each of them. "He is here as a weapon against chaos itself," Nathalion said quietly, as if speaking to himself as much as to his men, his voice resonating with an almost zealous conviction. And any doubts should have faded after what he did to Angron. But still the murmurs continued, a subtle ripple of unease that passed between the Marines as they laboured over the designs. Hours bled into days. The relentless hum of arc welders and the rhythmic chanting of tech priests created an almost hypnotic atmosphere. The initial smiles of excitement had given way to solemn determination as they worked to bring the Doomslayer's weapons to life. In rare moments of reprieve, Nathalion found himself deep in thought. The unsettling image of the Doomslayer's furious combat style haunted his mind. The stranger's ferocity had saved countless lives, but there was an edge to his violence, a darkness that lurked just beneath the surface, a primal fury that bordered on berserk rage. One evening, as Nathalion oversaw the assembly of the weapon's final components, Chaplain Kalen approached, his expression solemn. "Captain," he began, his voice lowered, "we cannot ignore the Psyker's warnings. They speak of an aura of darkness clinging to him. Since Angron fell, the librarians sensed it as a resonance, a lingering presence from the warp." Nathalion's gaze turned hard, his features set in a stern line. "He is an ally. He has saved us time and again. Any questions of his loyalty should have faded by now." But the chaplain held his ground, his brow furrowed with concern. "I do not question his loyalty, Captain, but the Psykers say it is as though Angron's taint itself lingers with him. This is not a matter of doubt, but of caution. If he harbours something of the warp, it could endanger us all." Nathalion's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening, though he could see the wisdom in Kalen's words. After a moment, he relented with a weary nod. "Fine. Let the librarians watch him. Ensure that he remains with us until we know more." Kalen bowed, his face troubled, but he respected his captain's decision. As the days passed, the mood aboard the battle barge shifted, a silent tension spreading among the salamanders. Rumours of the Doomslayer's shadowed aura only grew as they neared the completion of his weapon, the whispers tempered by an almost feverish anticipation of its power. The immense firearm, which they named the BFG 40,000, sat within the forge, a symbol of strength that seemed to defy even the laws of physics with its sheer size and power. Peace was fleeting.
It was during the final moments of the weapon's assembly when the ship's lower decks shuddered violently. The blare of alarms split the silence like a dagger. A shrill, unending wail filled the corridors, signalling a full-scale incursion. Within seconds, reports flooded through the Vox. Dark Eldar, twisted worshippers of Slanesh, had breached the ship's void shields, slipping in through sleek, midnight-coloured vessels. The voice of Nathalion echoed through the ship, sharp and commanding. "Brothers, we are under attack by the depraved Xenos. Rally to defend the ship. The Emperor watches over us. Let no Xenos defile our sacred ground." In the training area, the Doomslayer's head snapped up, the klaxons cutting through his focus. Around him, salamanders raced for their weapons, gathering arms with the practiced precision of seasoned warriors. His gaze turned to the corridor beyond, his senses sharpening, a fierce intensity kindling within him as he strode towards the hangar, the pulse of battle already driving his blood. The scene in the hangar was a nightmare. Dark Eldar Cabalites flitted through the shadows, their sharp, angular armour blending with the darkened walls as they moved with brutal efficiency. Blood streaked the floor, where tech priests and ship personnel lay lifeless or writhing in agony, their bodies twisted and broken by the Xenos' cruel devices. The shrieks and laughter of the witch echoed, each sound a grotesque symphony of death. The Doomslayer's fists clenched, his vision tinged with red as his rage began to boil. Without hesitation, he launched himself into the fray, his every movement a blur of deadly precision. His fists shattered armour, his boots cracked bone, and his rage became a living force, sweeping through the Dark Eldar ranks with an unstoppable fury. Where the salamanders wielded their chainswords and bolters with practiced discipline, he fought like a force of nature, a storm of wrath that left shattered bodies in his wake. As the carnage continued, the salamanders began to feel the raw weight of his wrath, an intensity that went beyond even their own hardened resolve. They watched as he tore through the Dark Eldar with a savagery that bordered on the primal, his hands bloodied as he ripped into their ranks one by one. For every salamander that fell, he retaliated tenfold, leaving the floor littered with mangled corpses. Nathalion was the first to notice the change, his gaze darkening as he watched the Doomslayer's unrelenting fury. This was more than mere combat. It was something almost feral, an unrestrained violence that left even his hardened brothers uneasy. As the last of the Cabalites in the hangar fell, Nathalion approached, his expression grave. "Slayer," he said firmly, resting a hand on his ally's shoulder. "The fight is over." The Doomslayer froze, his breathing ragged, his gaze still burning with the heat of battle. Slowly, his eyes met Nathalion's, the blood-stained frenzy subsiding as he recognized the captain. The intensity eased, though the fire still smouldered behind his eyes, an unquenchable rage barely held in check. Nathalion exhaled, a faint smile softening his otherwise hard expression. "Your weapon is ready," he said, nodding towards the corridor. "Would you care to test it?" A flicker of excitement crossed the Doomslayer's face as he nodded, following Nathalion through the maze of hallways to the forge. There, in the centre of the chamber, the BFG 40,000 waited, a hulking masterpiece of raw power, its massive barrel glowing with an intense energy that seemed to hum with restrained fury. The Doomslayer approached, his fingers trailing over the cold metal as he familiarized himself with the weapon's weight and balance. The anticipation in the room was almost tangible as he lifted it, his hands steady, his gaze locked onto the viewport where the Dark Eldar vessel hovered in retreat, likely eager to escape with their lives and tales of their failed assault. Nathalion's voice held a note of satisfaction. They've tried to taint this sacred place with their filth. Let them feel the Emperor's wrath. The Doomslayer raised the BFG 40,000, the ship's lights dimming as the weapon's core charged, an ominous glow pulsing within its depths. His muscles tensed as he aimed, feeling the vast power thrumming through his fingers. And then, in a single thunderous motion, he pulled the trigger. The BFG roared to life, the blast a surge of searing green energy that lanced through the void, its sheer force enough to send nearby Marines stumbling back. It struck the Dark Eldar ship with a cataclysmic impact, the hull rupturing instantly, the explosion expanding outward in a brilliant flash that consumed everything in its path.
Even the Xenors and their escape pods found no mercy, as the wave of destruction vaporized them in an instant. As the light faded, silence reigned, the salamanders staring in awe, the thrill of victory mingling with a newfound reverence for the weapon and its bearer. The Doomslayer lowered. The BFG tilted slightly as the Doomslayer smirked, a subtle curve at the corner of his mouth. He turned towards Nath Allen. Nathalia nodded, approval etched on his face. Well done, Slayer. The Emperor would be proud. The Doomslayer returned the nod, a glint of satisfaction briefly illuminating his otherwise stoic gaze. He allowed himself one last look at the shattered remnants of the Jakari ship through the viewport, the embers of destruction fading into the vast black of space. Though he rarely displayed emotion, something akin to triumph flickered in his eyes. This was his purpose, to obliterate those who brought ruin to others. The weight of silence descended upon the battle barge's command deck. Salamanders and the Doomslayer gathered around the hollow table. Despite their victory over Angron and the Jakari, an unsettling stillness permeated the warriors. Nath Allen's voice cut through the quiet, his deep baritone resonating through the tension. Brothers, if we are to take the fight to the Chaos Gods themselves, then we cannot linger. Our path lies ahead, in the heart of the Eye of Terror. Several of the Marines exchanged uneasy glances. The Eye of Terror was infamous, a warp rift of mind-bending horror where even the mightiest fleets had been swallowed whole, leaving only whispers of madness and death in their wake. For most, it was a journey that symbolized certain doom. But when they looked toward the Doomslayer, they saw no hesitation, only an unwavering resolve that radiated like an aura. His fists clenched, his expression steely as he spoke in his usual few words. "Take me there," he rumbled, the sound vibrating deep within his chest. Nath Allen's brows knitted. He gave a single, solemn nod. "There is a chance, Slayer. However, once we enter the Eye, there's no guarantee that we'll leave. The warp twists reality there, breaking minds, corrupting bodies. And yet, if anyone can survive this hell, it is you." He turned to the crew and issued the command. "Set a course for the Eye of Terror." The Salamander's battle barge turned its prow toward the distant, swirling maelstrom of energy on the edge of their visual scanners. The eye loomed like a monstrous wound in the fabric of reality, its edges a chaotic dance of purples, greens and reds. Lightning flashed within its depths as though it were alive. It beckoned with a malign hunger that tested even the strongest of spirits. As they closed the distance, the horrors awaiting them became clearer. The space around the eye began to distort, the boundaries of reality thinning as the warp bled into real space. Colours took on a dissonant, nightmarish quality, and faint whispers echoed within the minds of the crew, like the faint stirrings of forgotten nightmares. "The warp is seeping into real space," murmured one of the tech priests, his mechanical voice betraying a hint of fear. "No Imperial craft has survived long here." Nathaniel remained resolute, his gaze fixed ahead. "We are salamanders. We do not fear fire nor darkness." His words steeled their nerves, and the warriors prepared themselves. As they approached the edge of the rift, a pulse of energy surged from the eye, and suddenly enemy signatures lit up the holotable. The salamanders braced themselves as a fleet of dark ships, twisted and malformed, erupted from the warp. The traitor legions had arrived, vessels bearing the mark of the World Bearers, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and many more. And with them came the chanting of dark prayers, war cries to the ruinous powers that filled the air like a sinister hymn. "Traitor Astartes," Nathalia growled, his voice steady but laced with contempt. "The forces of chaos come to protect their blasphemous masters. Prepare for combat." In the hangars, salamanders hurriedly mounted their thunderhawks, while those remaining on the deck manned defense stations, readying the barge's weapons for the coming storm. The Doomslayer stood at the center of the hangar, his eyes focused on the twisted vessels looming ahead. He raised the BFG 9000, his fingers tightening around the grip as he awaited the command. With a roar that seemed to shake the heavens, the traitor legions attacked. Ships clashed in brutal void combat, lasers and plasma scorching the emptiness as the salamanders met their corrupted kin with righteous fury. The battle barge's turrets spewed torrents of fire, tearing through Chaos ships, while Thunderhawks unleashed their own payloads. The Doomslayer led the first wave, descending from the barge into the swirling masses of Chaos Marines that began spilling from drop pods onto the barge's lower decks. The Doomslayer moved like an unstoppable tide, his massive gun carving through the enemy lines with terrifying ease. Every pull of the trigger sent bolts of searing green energy cascading into the traitor Marines, obliterating them before they could react. He marched forward relentlessly, his fury as potent as any weapon. Around him, the salamanders rallied, chanting hymns to the Emperor as they fought. And yet, the forces of chaos seemed unending. For every squad of traitor Astartes that fell, 3 more appeared, pouring from the warp in twisted void ships with a fervour that defied logic. World bearers shouted their blasphemous litanies, bolstering their brethren even as they fell. Alpha Legionnaires moved like phantoms, striking from the shadows, their movements masked by illusions that defied the senses. Gradually, the salamanders began to be pushed back, their defences strained to the breaking point. A flash of red signalled the arrival of Khorne berserkers, who surged through the battle lines with a frenzy that matched the Doomslayer's own, cutting down anyone in their path with blood-soaked axes. The salamanders fought valiantly, but their numbers dwindled as the forces of chaos continued their relentless assault. Amid the chaos, the Doomslayer's rage reached its zenith. His breath came in harsh, controlled huffs, his movements growing more ferocious as he realized they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He reached out, grabbing Nathalia by the shoulder with a force that surprised even the Salamander captain. "My other weapon," he demanded, his voice a growl that seemed to carry over the din of battle. "Is it ready?" Nathalia hesitated, his eyes wary. "It hasn't been tested. We don't even know if it will—" "Give it to me," the Doomslayer interrupted, his gaze burning. He didn't have time for uncertainty. He needed something to turn the tide. Nathalia signalled to a nearby tech priest, who ran off and returned moments later with a long, heavy sword. Its blade, dark and glistening, had veins of volatile energy pulsing just beneath the surface. The Doomslayer took it in his hands, feeling the weapon hum with power. It was the Salamander version of the Crucible, forged with the rarest metals and imbued with a shard of warp energy. But it was a different beast altogether. Stronger, deadlier, and potentially far more unstable. As he held the sword aloft, the blade ignited in a blaze of green flame, the raw energy of the warp spilling forth. For a brief moment, the battlefield fell silent, as Chaos Marines and Salamanders alike turned to behold the sight. The blade's glow cast eerie shadows on the twisted armour of the traitors, and even the blood-crazed berserkers seemed to hesitate, sensing a power that could not be denied. With a roar, the Doomslayer surged forward, the sword raised high. He became a whirlwind of death, the blade carving through enemy armour and flesh as though it were paper. The Chaos Marines fell in waves, their bodies disintegrating as the sword's power unleashed torrents of searing green energy that left nothing but ash in their wake. He moved through the enemy ranks with a savagery that inspired both fear and rally the Salamanders around him. The battle shifted. The Salamanders surged, their spirits rekindled by the sight of their indomitable ally. They fought with renewed fury, chain swords roaring and bolters cracking, pushing back the traitors as the Doomslayer led the charge, the crucible blazing light illuminating the battlefield. Chaos Marines scrambled to retreat, their blasphemous chants now replaced with cries of fear as they realized their god's might was nothing compared to the wrath before them. Despite their ferocity, the numbers of the Chaos Marines began to thin, their ranks shattered under the weight of the Doomslayer's assault. He moved with relentless purpose, his every step driving them further back until only a few remained, scrambling toward the safety of the warp. As they fled, the Doomslayer watched them, his eyes blazing with cold fury. Nathalia stepped forward, bloodied but unbroken, a fierce pride in his gaze as he addressed his ally. "Slayer, they retreated to the warp. We've beaten them." But the Doomslayer shook his head, his voice low and filled with unyielding determination. "We're going after them," he growled, his eyes fixed on the swirling portal that marks the entrance to the warp. Nathalia glanced at his brothers, who shared his look of fierce determination. Their loyalty was resolute. They had followed him this far, and they would follow him still. "Then let's finish this," he said with a nod, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The Salamanders rallied, their battle barge following the fleeing traitors into the warp. As they crossed into the Eye of Terror, reality twisted around them, nightmarish visions filling their minds as the warp's dark energies threatened to unravel their sanity. But the Doomslayer stood firm, an anchor of unbreakable will. The warp stretched before them, a churning sea of horrors and madness. The The Salamanders held their ground. They would descend into the heart of darkness, not to survive, but to destroy. And in the center of it all, the Doomslayer stood as their champion, a force that even the Chaos gods themselves would come to fear. The descent into the Eye of Terror was more than just a physical journey. It was a descent into a place where time twisted, where minds fractured, and where only the most unyielding spirits could maintain any semblance of sanity. The Salamander's barge lurched and groaned as it moved through the warp, its once mighty hull wailing in protest under the immense, corrupt energies that pressed upon it from all sides. All around them, swirling tendrils of darkness bled across the void, shrouding the void shields. Shades of lurid purple and green, demonic faces flickered in and out of reality, phantoms of hate and hunger that licked at the Salamander's hull, their howls clawing at the souls of those who dared enter this forbidden realm. On the bridge, Captain Nath Allen tightened his grip around the edges of the hollow table, his steely gaze fixed on the shifting storm of the warp outside. With each moment, the gravity of their mission weighed heavier on him, yet his resolve remained unwavering. Around him, the stoic salamanders kept their focus, chanting prayers to the Emperor in soft murmurs that cut through the eerie silence. And there, in the heart of their formation, stood the Doomslayer, as unmovable as a mountain, his presence alone steeling the hearts of even the most hardened salamanders. The Doomslayer was not merely a warrior among them. He was a weapon, an embodiment of vengeance, an unstoppable force that would stop at nothing to achieve his end. The Salamander's battle barge tore through the warp, engines straining against the overwhelming currents of dark energy. The boundaries of reality had ceased to exist here. Everything twisted and merged, fracturing into grotesque shapes. As they neared their destination, Khorne's fortress loomed on the horizon, a monstrosity of brass and iron surrounded by lakes of boiling blood. Each tower was crowned with battlements made from the bones of vanquished foes, while banners stitched from flayed flesh fluttered in winds that reeked of rot and despair. Captain Nath Allen tightened his fists, his gaze fixed on the fortress as he addressed his men, the edges of his voice hardened by resolve. We fight today not for survival, but for the honor of striking at a foe no one else dares to face. The forces of the warp will try to break us, to twist us, but we are salamanders. Our will is forged in flame, and we fear no evil. His words fueled the salamanders' zeal, their chants of faith intensifying into a rolling thunder that mirrored the flames of their spirits. Even here, in the darkest recesses of the universe, the salamanders would make their stand. Beside Nath Allen, the Doomslayer stood like a living weapon of vengeance, his gaze locked on the towering brass gates of the fortress ahead. He had one purpose: to meet Khorne on the field of battle and to end him. With a nod from the Doomslayer, the salamanders surged forward, thousands of battle-ready Astartes advancing across the nightmarish terrain, their armour glinting in sickly hues as they marched unwavering toward the heart of Khorne's domain. The land twisted and groaned beneath their feet,
each step bringing them closer to the enemy. The first wave came swiftly from the shadows of twisted cliffs and valleys. Demons erupted, twisted forms of rage and hate, nightmarish horrors with claws like scythes and teeth dripping with venom. They charged with a frenzy, bloodlust in their eyes burning with madness as they hurled themselves against the Salamanders' forward lines.
"Forward!"
Nath Allen roared, igniting his weapon,
a power sword blazing with green flame. The Salamanders met the enemy, with bolters roaring and chainswords snarling. They fired in disciplined volleys, each shot finding its mark, and the front lines of the demonic horde dissolved into a frenzy of dismembered limbs and shrieks of agony. For every demon felled, 2 more seemed to take its place. Bloodletters leaped into the salamander lines, their wickedly curved blades seeking the flesh of the faithful. Lesser demons surged forward, only to be met by walls of green flames as the salamanders' flamers purged the ground of all who stood against them. The Doomslayer was at the heart of the storm, moving with a relentless fury, his BFG 9000 blazing, each discharge a searing green explosion that tore through entire ranks of demons. His path was one of devastation, bodies falling like leaves around him as he carved his way toward the fortress. Hours passed as the salamanders waded through wave after wave of demons. The terrain around them shifted and warped, mountains of bones rising where none had been before, rivers of blood twisting and expanding as if feeding on the carnage. The salamanders pressed on, their relentless advance marked by the broken forms of the warp's denizens. Finally, after a grueling march through hellish terrain, they reached the base of Khorne's fortress. The immense gates loomed over them, forged from iron and engraved with scenes of endless slaughter. The doors creaked open slowly, a sinister rumble that echoed through the canyon. From within the darkness, a booming voice echoed, dripping with mockery. "Slayer." The Doomslayer's eyes narrowed as Khorne emerged from the fortress, towering over his domain. The blood god was a mountain of muscle and iron, his skin the colour of fresh blood, his eyes burning embers of unrestrained fury. He clutched a massive axe that radiated a blood-red light. The very air around it seemed to warp from the sheer malevolence of its presence.
"Come, Slayer," Khorne sneered, his voice like an avalanche. "You think yourself powerful, but here in my realm, you are nothing but prey." The Doomslayer's response was simple. He raised his BFG 9000 and aimed it directly at the blood god. With a roar, Khorne charged, his axe slicing through the air with a speed that defied his size. The ground shook with every step, and with each swing of his weapon, dozens of salamanders were hurled aside, their armor crushed like paper. The Doomslayer fired, each shot of green energy slamming into Khorne's body. But the blood god shrugged off the attacks, his hide impervious to mortal weaponry. In an instant, Khorne was upon the Doomslayer, his massive fist swinging down with bone-crushing force. The Doomslayer dodged, his movements a blur as he leaped back, barely evading the deadly arc of Khorne's axe. The blood god was relentless, each strike of his weapon sending shock waves through the battlefield, shattering rocks and leaving craters in the ground around them. The salamanders continued their fight, battling demons that poured from the fortress, desperate to halt the invasion, But their numbers dwindled with every passing moment as Khorne's monstrous strength cleaved through them. The Doomslayer fought with unmatched fury, darting in and out, his fists ablur as he delivered blow after blow. But Khorne was like a living fortress, each punch and kick absorbed by his iron-bound flesh, with no sign of pain or weakness. Finally, Khorne caught the Doomslayer off guard, a massive fist slamming into his chest and hurling him back. The impact shattered a boulder, and for a moment the Doomslayer was still, stunned by the force of the blow. Khorne laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed across the battlefield. "Is that all, Slayer? Is this the might that would challenge a god?" The Doomslayer struggled to his feet, his gaze unwavering as he stared down the blood god. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold,
unbreakable determination. Reaching down, he retrieved the crucible sword, its dark blade thrumming with a lethal power. Khorne's laughter stopped, his eyes narrowing as he watched the Doomslayer raise the sword. The blade ignited, green flames licking around its edge as it pulsed with deadly energy. Without a word, the Doomslayer lunged forward, the crucible blazing in his grip. Khorne swung his axe in response, but this time the Doomslayer was ready. He twisted, dodging the deadly arc of the blade, and closed the distance in a heartbeat. The crucible sliced through the air, meeting Khorne's body with a crackling hiss as the blade bit into the blood god's flesh. Khorne roared in pain, a sound that seemed to shake the heavens. For the first time, the blood god had been wounded. Enraged, he lashed out, his fists like hammers as he tried to crush the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer was relentless, each strike of the crucible biting deeper into Khorne's flesh, searing through muscle and bone. With a final, desperate swing, Khorne brought his axe down, but the Doomslayer sidestepped, raising the BFG 9000 and aiming directly at Khorne's head. He pulled the trigger, and a bolt of searing energy erupted from the barrel, slamming into Khorne's skull. The blood god's head exploded in a shower of blood, brain, and bone, his massive body collapsing to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. But then, as the blood pooled around his body, Khorne's head began to reform, his skull knitting back together as he laughed, a deep, echoing sound that radiated through the warp. "Fools," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "I cannot be killed. I am eternal." The Doomslayer clenched his jaw, a glint of dark resolve in his eyes as he raised the crucible sword once more. This time, he launched himself upward, leaping high above Khorne's towering form. With a single, powerful stroke, he brought the sword down, driving the blade directly between Khorne's eyes. The blood god's laughter ceased, his body convulsing as the blade seared through his mind, severing his connection to the warp. For a brief moment, Khorne's eyes widened in shock, and then his form dissolved, his body collapsing into ash as the power of the crucible consumed him from within. As Khorne's essence faded, the warp itself trembled. A shockwave radiated from the fallen god, rippling through the warp and into real space, a tremor that shook planets
and shattered stars. Far away, on the throne of terror, the Emperor's eyes flickered open, a spark of life returning to his gaze, colour seeping back into his once lifeless eyes. He had felt it, the death of a god, the seismic shift in the balance of power. As the final echoes of Khorne's death knell faded into silence, the battlefield lay still. The salamanders, bruised and bloodied yet triumphant, could scarcely believe their eyes. The blood god, an immortal embodiment of hatred and violence, had fallen, his massive form reduced to ash. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of scorched metal and pulverized bones. A few soldiers fell to their knees in awe. Others roared with exhausted pride, a primal cheer breaking from their ranks as they raised their weapons, voices echoing across the cursed plains. The Doomslayer, standing amidst the remains of Khorne, was as solid and unyielding as a stone, his armour battered and blood-streaked but still unbent, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. The crucible sword, still embedded in Khorne's shattered skull, pulsed with an eerie glow, its green flames licking hungrily over the blood god's remains. With Khorne's death, the unholy pressure of the warp had lifted. The energy around them destabilized, leaving them standing within a surreal moment of respite amidst the surreal chaos. In the distance, Captain Nath Allen's weary gaze fixed on the Doomslayer, admiration shining through his exhaustion.
"Salamanders!" he roared, his voice hoarse but resolute.
"Behold our victory! Let it be known that we stood unyielding in the face of the dark gods." His voice trembled with fierce pride as the chants of his warriors rose louder than the whispering void around them. But then, a cold shadow slithered across the battlefield. One salamander brother, Althon, bolted upright mid-cheer, his face twisted in sudden pain as he staggered back, clutching at his stomach. Around him, his brothers turned, eyes wide with concern. "Althon?" one asked, stepping forward, but the words froze on his lips as they watched in horror. Althon's skin began to darken, sickly and grey, and bloated pustules formed, festering and bursting along his exposed flesh. His body convulsed as his skin began to rot, layers of flesh sloughing off in grotesque waves, leaving a ghastly trail of decayed tissue behind. His armour, once a proud emerald, turned putrid as viscous fluid seeped out, corroding even the ceramite beneath. The other salamanders watched, rooted in horror, as Althon's skin twisted and tore, his face a rictus of agony as the pestilence consumed him. Then, from the darkness surrounding them, came a deep, rumbling laugh. The ground shook, and from the twisted shadows stepped a bloated, putrid figure oozing with decay and malignancy. Flies swarmed around him, clouds of pestilence rolling from his diseased form. This was Nurgle, the Plague Father, and his eyes sparkled with a dark, malicious joy as he beheld the salamander's horror. "Oh, little mortals," he crooned, his voice a sickly sweet mockery. "How fragile you truly are." The Doomslayer's response was swift. With a flash of green, he levelled his BFG 9000 and fired, a beam of searing energy tearing through the putrid miasma.
The beam struck Nurgle head-on, blasting chunks of rotten flesh and sending a spray of vile fluid across the battlefield. Nurgle reeled back, his grotesque laughter faltering for a moment as his bloated flesh sizzled and bubbled. But even as the energy dissipated,
the god of disease laughed again, his wounds knitting together, his rotting form regenerating with ease. As the Doomslayer prepared to fire another blast, the shadows around him shifted and coalesced, swirling in vibrant hues that warped and shifted like the colours of a fever dream. Emerging from this riot of colours was a figure clad in robes that shifted and shimmered, their outline flickering as though reality itself could not contain their form. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, lord of deception and sorcery, now stood beside Nurgle, his avian-like face twisting in a knowing sneer.
"Oh, Slayer,"
Tzeentch purred, his voice a serpent's hiss.
"You think yourself powerful, do you? But you know nothing of the true, unfathomable depths of the warp's power."
Zachanel's eyes glittered with wicked amusement, a predatory light shining in their depths. He raised a clawed hand, the air crackling with anticipation. Strange, unsettling symbols flared with eldritch energy around his gauntleted fingers. In an instant, he unleashed a storm, a cataclysm of arcane energy. Tendrils of purple lightning, crackling and spitting with otherworldly power, snaked out towards the Doomslayer, seeking to obliterate him. The Doomslayer, however, was a whirlwind of motion. He dodged, rolled, a blur against the desolate landscape. He narrowly avoided the searing tendrils that melted the very ground where they struck, leaving smoking craters of superheated rock. He straightened, muscles coiled and ready, aiming the BFG towards Zachanel. But before he could unleash its devastating power, a seductive, lilting laugh echoed across the battlefield. It resonated from the far side of the arena, a sound that promised pleasure and pain in equal measure. A figure materialized, a being of nightmarish beauty, radiating an aura of dark allure, stood before them. It tugged at the hearts and minds of all who beheld them, a siren call promising forbidden delights. Slaanesh, the dark prince of excess, surveyed the battlefield with a cruel grin. Her eyes glittered with perverse pleasure as she drank in the chaos and suffering around them, savouring the agony as a connoisseur savours a fine wine.
"Oh, such lovely pain,"
Slaanesh whispered, her voice soft and sweet, yet laden with an undercurrent of pure, unadulterated malice.
"Let me add to it."
With a flick of her wrist, Slaanesh unleashed a wave of psychic energy. It rippled through the air, an invisible force that slammed into the remaining salamanders. The impact was devastating. It overwhelmed their minds, tearing through their defences like a hot knife through butter. The warriors clutched their heads, their once unshakable resolve crumbling under the onslaught of twisted visions and seductive promises. One by one, they dropped to their knees, their minds fractured and broken by the overwhelming force of Slaanesh's power. Only a few managed to stand, defying the Dark Prince's temptation through sheer
indomitable will. But even they trembled, their bodies battered and weakened, their spirits teetering on the brink of collapse. The Doomslayer fought with unbridled fury, a man possessed. He tore through the demons that surrounded him, his fists a blur of motion. Each strike resonated with lethal force, each blow a hammer blow against the forces of chaos. He cleaved his way towards the crucible, still embedded in Khorne's skull, a beacon of hope in this nightmarish landscape. But every step was met with fresh waves of demons, an unending tide of teeth and claws, and the relentless presence of the three remaining chaos gods pressed down upon him like a suffocating shroud, threatening to crush him beneath their combined might. The battlefield itself shifted under Chaos's influence. The ground warped and twisted into grotesque shapes, forming nightmarish mockeries of nature. The demons that surged forward seemed to multiply endlessly, their forms merging and splitting,
their bodies becoming horrifying amalgams of flesh and metal. Reality itself fractured around them, becoming a canvas of madness. Nurgle's vile breath filled the air, a noxious miasma of disease and decay. Each gust sapped the Doomslayer's strength, rotting his flesh from within. His armor sparked and crackled, barely holding against the encroaching decay, a desperate bulwark against the inevitable. Slaanesha's laughter echoed in his mind, a seductive siren song that taunted him with visions of unfulfilled vengeance. His focus wavered as he fought to push back the intrusive whispers, the insidious temptations that threatened to consume him. Still, he pressed on, bloodied but unyielding. With a roar, he swung his fists in a brutal arc, sending a fresh wave of demons crashing back, their forms dissolving under his relentless assault. But even as he fought, he felt his strength waning. Each step was harder than the last, each breath a struggle. He looked around, searching for the crucible, the key to ending this madness. But the constant barrage of attacks kept him from closing the distance. His path was blocked by a wall of demons, their claws slashing at him, their teeth gnashing as they fought to bring him down. Around him, the salamanders lay scattered, their bodies broken and battered. A few still clung to life, their armor cracked and bloodied, fighting with desperate courage. But their numbers dwindled with every passing moment. Those who fell were consumed by the warp, their bodies dissolving into nothingness as the forces of chaos claimed their souls. The battlefield was a scene of utter devastation, a landscape of death and despair. The once proud warriors of the Emperor were being torn apart by the relentless tide of demons, their sacrifices seemingly in vain. The Doomslayer's vision blurred as he struggled to rise, his body bruised and bloodied, his movements slow and laboured. His grip tightened on his weapon, his gaze hard and unyielding as he faced the three chaos gods who loomed over him. Their twisted faces were lit with cruel amusement as they prepared to deliver the final blow. Zuchanel raised his staff, arcs of eldritch energy crackling around him as he prepared to unleash a final, devastating spell. Slaanesh smiled, her eyes glinting with sadistic delight as she watched the Doomslayer struggle, relishing the sight of his defiance crumbling before their gaze. Nurgle's bloated form shook with laughter, his rotten flesh bubbling as he prepared to claim the Doomslayer's soul and add it to his festering collection. And then The warp itself shuddered. A shockwave of pure, incandescent light erupted across the battlefield, bathing the broken land in a radiance that seemed to burn away the darkness. The Chaos Gods recoiled, their laughter turning to hisses of rage as they turned to face the source of the light. The air shimmered, distorted by the sheer power emanating from its source, and from the heart of the radiance, a figure emerged. A figure clad in golden armor, his form wreathed in a halo of light. His eyes blazed with a power that defied the darkness around him, a power that promised salvation and damnation in equal measure. The Emperor of mankind had returned. The Doomslayer looked up, his vision clearing as the radiant figure approached. His presence was like a beacon of hope amid the desolation, a promise of deliverance in this sea of despair. The Emperor extended his hand, his gaze steady and filled with unyielding resolve as he looked down at the battered warrior before him. "Rise, Doomslayer," the Emperor intoned, his voice a calm yet unbreakable force. "We fight as one." The Chaos Gods shuddered, their forms wavering as they felt the full weight of the Emperor's gaze upon them. The battlefield, once a cacophony of chaos and despair, now trembled with the resounding presence of the Emperor of mankind. His arrival signified not just hope, but a fierce reckoning against the vile Chaos Gods that sought to snuff out the last remnants of life and light in the galaxy. As the light radiated from his form, the essence of the warp twisted and recoiled, the malevolent entities feeling the weight of his divine power. The Doomslayer, battered yet unyielding, looked up at the Emperor, a fierce resolve igniting within him. Gone was the despair, and in its place stood a titan of faith and fury, ready to unleash hell upon his enemies. The three remaining Chaos Gods, witnessing the Emperor's emergence, snarled in outrage, their forms writhing with agitation. Zachanel, Nurgle, and Slaanesh exchanged glances, their amusement fading as dread washed over them. They had laughed at the mortals, at the defiance of the Salamanders and their indomitable spirit. But now they faced something far beyond their comprehension, a force that threatened their very existence. "Foolish mortals," Nurgle sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think a mere flicker of light can extinguish the darkness. The rot will consume you all." "Your time is over," the Emperor intoned, his voice echoing like thunder across the shattered plains. "Today, the might of the Imperium stands resolute against the twisted depravity you embody. This realm will know purity once more." With that declaration, the Emperor took a step forward, the very ground shaking beneath him. Golden energy surged through the air, forming a radiant shield around him and the Doomslayer. It enveloped them in a cocoon of sanctity, warding off the taint of the warp and bolstering their strength. The Doomslayer felt the warmth of the Emperor's light surge through him, fueling his fury and determination. He hefted his BFG 40,000, the weapon crackling with renewed power as he prepared for the onslaught ahead. Zachanel, seeing his influence waning, unleashed a torrent of arcane energy. Tendrils of purple lightning streaked towards the duo, seeking to overwhelm them with raw power. But before the malevolent energy could reach them, the Emperor raised a hand. A brilliant shield shimmered into existence, deflecting the attack with ease. The warp around them shimmered, distorting as the tide of chaos met the steadfast resolve of the Emperor's will. "Now, Doomslayer," the Emperor commanded. "Strike!" With a roar that resonated through the very fabric of the warp, the Doomslayer charged forward. The shield of light cascaded around him like an aura of vengeance, a protective barrier against the forces of darkness. He moved with blinding speed, a whirlwind of fury as he closed the distance to Zachannel, who stood aghast at the sudden turn of events. The Doomslayer unleashed a volley of fire from the BFG 40,000, a beam of searing energy that carved through the air with deadly precision. It struck Zachannel head-on, the god of change howling in rage as his form erupted in a blaze of iridescent light. But even as the energy scorched him, Zachannel's body twisted and shifted, regenerating as he danced back into the shadows, laughter spilling from his lips like a venomous whisper. "Your power is fleeting, Slayer," he taunted, his form flickering like a mirage. "The warp bends to my will." "Fool!" the Emperor bellowed, his voice a clarion call. "You believe yourself the master of illusion, yet you are nothing but a puppet." With a swift motion, the Emperor raised his arm high, summoning an array of golden bolts of divine energy. They arced through the air, striking the ground around Zachannel and igniting in a brilliant explosion of light. The Chaos God howled in fury, struggling to maintain his form as the radiant energy shattered his concentration. Seizing the opportunity, the Doomslayer charged forward once more, the crucible sword now aflame with the ethereal energy of the Emperor's power. He lunged at Zachannel, the sword arcing through the air with lethal intent. Its blade shimmered with a golden and luminescent glow, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. The edge met Zachannel's form, slicing through the illusion and striking true. The blade cleaved into the God of Change, disrupting his essence and severing his connection to the warp. Zachannel's form splintered into motes of light, dispersing momentarily before reforming behind the Doomslayer. "You cannot defeat what cannot be pinned down," he hissed, launching another assault of arcane energy. But the Doomslayer was prepared. He spun around, the sword raised high as he deflected the tendrils of lightning, sending them spiraling back into the chaos from whence they came. The energy crackled all around him, illuminating the battlefield with bursts of blinding light. "Together," the Emperor commanded, his voice resonating through the tumult. "Focus your might." In that moment, their wills intertwined, a bond forged in the fires of battle. The Emperor's golden light melded with the Doomslayer's primal fury, forming an unbreakable force. As they launched their counteroffensive, the air thickened with energy, becoming a tangible manifestation of their combined might. They surged forward, their combined power a testament to the resilience of the Imperium against the darkness. As they fought, Nurgle's grotesque laughter filled the air, a repulsive sound that promised only suffering and despair. His bloated form moved forward with deliberate slowness, oozing with rot and decay. "You think your efforts will change the inevitable? Embrace the plague. Surrender to the decay," he bellowed, summoning swarms of flies that encircled around him, forming festering clouds of disease that threatened to engulf the battlefield. The Doomslayer turned to face Nurgle, his grip tightening around the hilt
of the crucible sword. "Not today," he roared, charging towards the Plaguefather with the ferocity that could shake the heavens. Nurgle responded by unleashing a noxious breath, a cloud of putrid decay that filled the air with the rancid stench. It sapped the strength from all who inhaled it, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. The Doomslayer skidded to a halt, raising his BFG 40,000 and firing into the cloud. The beam of energy sliced through the decay, creating a pathway to Nurgle. But the god merely laughed, his form swelling and pulsating as he absorbed the energy. "You are strong, Doomslayer, but strength alone will not save you from the rot." Nurgle mocked, his voice a sickly sweet melody of corruption. "Stay steadfast, Doomslayer. Remember your purpose. Fight for the living," the Emperor shouted, infusing the air with renewed resolve. With a guttural roar, the Doomslayer charged again, dodging the tendrils of decay that lashed out at him like grasping hands. He reached Nurgle,
swinging the crucible sword with devastating force. The blade sliced through the Plaguefather's flesh, sending waves of corrupt filth spraying across the ground. Nurgle recoiled, his laughter fading into agonized howls.
"No, you cannot harm me. I am eternal,"
he bellowed. But the Doomslayer pressed on, relentless and unyielding. With each strike, the defences of Nurgle failed, the very essence of the plague god under siege. The Emperor stepped forward, raising his hand to channel more of his divine power, the ground beneath them shaking as he summoned the fury of the Imperium itself. "Let the light cleanse this realm of your foul presence," the Emperor shouted, directing a stream of golden energy that surged forward, converging with the Doomslayer's attacks. The combined force exploded against Nurgle, a cataclysmic blast of purity that shattered the corruption around them. As the dust settled, Nurgle's form lay in ruins, his essence dissipating like mist in the morning sun. "This cannot be," he whispered, his voice fading into nothingness. With a triumphant roar, the Doomslayer turned his gaze to Slaanesh, who stood watching the battle unfold, her twisted features contorted with rage. "You will not escape," the Doomslayer bellowed, his voice echoing across the expanse. "Oh, little mortal," Slaanesh hissed, her voice dripping with seduction and malice. "You think you can defeat desire? I am everything you crave, and more." With a wave of her hand, Slaanesh unleashed a torrent of psychic energy, an onslaught of temptations that seeped into the minds of the surviving salamanders, tainting their thoughts with visions of glory and pleasure. The remaining salamanders fell to their knees, clutching their heads as their resolve crumbled. The battlefield seemed to warp around them, Slaanesh's laughter echoing as they revelled in the chaos they had sown. But the Emperor's voice rose above the din, a clarion call that pierced the veil of despair. "Salamanders, stand firm. Remember your oaths and your duty. Do not succumb to the darkness." With renewed strength, the Doomslayer turned to the Emperor, their eyes locking in a moment of shared purpose. "We fight for them," he declared, his voice a resonant promise for all of humanity. They surged forward, the combined might of the Emperor and the Doomslayer striking at Slaanesh with an intensity that lit up the battlefield. Slaanesh recoiled, her form flickering as the light bore down upon them.
"No! You cannot do this! You will pay for your insolence!"
she screamed, her voice a shriek of fury. But the Doomslayer was relentless. He lunged forward, the crucible sword raised high, its blade shimmering with radiant energy as he sliced through Slaaneish's defences, plunging the sword deep into the heart of the Dark Prince of Excess. Slaanesh let out a wail that echoed through the warp, her form dissolving into a cascade of shimmering light.
"I will return. You cannot rid the universe of desire,"
she cried, her voice fading into the ether. With Slaanesh vanquished, the battlefield stood silent, the remnants of the Chaos Gods dissipating into nothingness. The air cleared, the noxious energies of the warp receding. The Emperor and the Doomslayer stood triumphant amid the ashes of their foes. The Emperor turned to the Doomslayer, a glint of respect in his eyes. "You fought bravely, Slayer. The blood of the gods stains your hands." The Doomslayer, panting but resolute, met the gaze of the Emperor and simply nodded. As the final echoes of the battle faded, the Emperor extended his hand, a warm light radiating from his palm. "You have proven yourself worthy. I offer you a choice, Doomslayer. You may return to your world, to the chaos that birthed you. Or you can stand beside me as a Primarch of the Imperium and lead my legions to glory." The weight of the decision hung in the air, the gravity of the moment pressing down upon them. The Doomslayer glanced toward Captain Nathalion, who was slowly rising to his feet, battered but alive, the spirit of the Salamanders flickering within him. The Doomslayer pointed to his comrade Nathalion and swung his BFG 40,000 over his shoulder, signaling his intent to stay and fight with his new brothers. The Emperor nodded, a proud smile breaking through his stoic visage. "Then rise, Doomslayer, Primarch of the 21st Legion. You may choose your own men, but be quick, for our crusade cannot wait any longer." With a final surge of light, the Emperor raised his hand and the fabric of the warp began to unravel, revealing the path back to reality. The Doomslayer stood at the forefront, flanked by the Emperor and Captain Nathalion, their resolve unbreakable as they stepped forward into the light, leaving behind the horrors of the Chaos Gods. As they emerged, the battlefield of the warp faded away, replaced by the familiar sights of the Imperium. The flickering lights of the ships in the void, the warmth of the stars above, and the relentless pulse of humanity thriving against the odds. Thus, the saga of the Doomslayer and the Emperor began, a tale of redemption and unity forged in the fires of battle. The Salamanders would rise, a force to be reckoned with, their legacy etched in the annals of history. Together, they would face whatever darkness lay ahead, unyielding in their resolve, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of humanity. The rise of the Doomslayer as Primarch of the 21st Legion, the Doom Guard, born out of the remnants of the Salamanders, marked the beginning of a new era for the Imperium. Under his fierce leadership and unwavering commitment to protect humanity, the Doom Guard became some of the deadliest defenders of the Imperium. Word of their triumph against the Chaos Gods spread throughout the stars, a beacon of hope for all who faced the terrors of the galaxy. The Doom Guard were no longer just a chapter of warriors, they became legends, their tales woven into the very fabric of Imperial lore. However, while their ranks would swell in the years to come, Chaos's defeat had not gone unnoticed. And while the Emperor had returned, other forces in the galaxy had sensed the imminent threat and would begin to do whatever it took to ensure their own survival.